A man died on a beach in 1610, and we're still arguing about whether he was murdered. His body was never properly identified. The circumstances were suspicious enough that 4 centuries later, forensic scientists exhumed what they thought were his remains to run DNA tests. This wasn't some political figure or military commander. This was a painter so violent, so revolutionary, so utterly transformative that his work changed art forever, while his life spiraled into chaos, exile, and a death that remains one of history's great unsolved mysteries. Michelangelo Merisi de Caravaggio didn't just paint differently, he lived differently. And those two things, the art and the life, were so tangled together that you can't understand one without the other. This is the story of how a stonemason's son from a plague-ravaged town became the most influential painter of his generation, then threw it all away in a series of increasingly violent encounters that read less like biography and more like a descent into hell painted in shadows and blood. September 29th, 1571. The feast day of the Archangel Michael. That's when Michelangelo Merisi entered the world, probably in the small agricultural town of Caravaggio in Lombardy, about 25 miles east of Milan. His father, Fermo Merisi, wasn't anyone important. He was a maestro, a master stonemason, qualified to employ apprentices, but nothing close to an architect. Fermo had a workshop in Milan, where the real work was, where buildings were going up, and stone needed cutting and shaping. The family split their time between Milan's chaos and Caravaggio's quiet, one foot in opportunity, one in provincial safety. But here's what mattered about young Michelangelo's family. What would save his life multiple times decades later? His mother's side had connections. Lucia Aratori came from slightly better stock. Her father had been a land surveyor who worked for Francesco Sforza, and more importantly, her aunt had been wet nurse to Sforza's children. That connection to the Colonna family, nobility with actual power, would become Caravaggio's lifeline when everything fell apart. When you're a stonemason's son, you need every advantage you can manufacture. The world Michelangelo was born into was drowning in religious intensity. Cardinal Borromeo had returned to Milan determined to purify the city's soul, and religious fervour was at its zealous peak. Churches everywhere, sermons about sin and salvation, art commissioned to inspire devotion and fear in equal measure. This wasn't gentle Christianity, this was fire and brimstone, graphic depictions of martyrdom, a faith that demanded total submission and promised eternal torment for the wicked. You grew up seeing paintings of saints being flayed alive, crucified upside down, shot full of arrows, violence in service of the divine. Remember that. It'll come back, and then everything shattered. In the summer of 1576, when Michelangelo was 5 years old, bubonic plague rolled through northern Italy like a scythe. Milan was hit hard. The family fled east to Caravaggio, where the population was less dense, where maybe they'd be safe. They weren't. In the second half of 1577, the plague killed Caravaggio's father, his paternal grandfather, his grandmother, his uncle Pietro. By age 6, almost every male member of his immediate family was dead. 1/5 of northern Italy's population succumbed. The Merisi family was nearly wiped out. Think about what that does to a child. You're 6 years old. You watch your father die, probably in agony, his body destroying itself from within. Black swellings, fever, delirium. Then your grandfather, then your grandmother, then your uncle. The plague didn't kill quickly or kindly. It was days of suffering, the body rotting while still alive. And you're 6, and everyone you depend on is gone except your mother and siblings. The psychologist Andrew Graham Dixon argues that Caravaggio's entire troubled adult life, the violence, the darkness, the obsession with mortality in his paintings, all of it stems from this childhood trauma. The plague didn't just kill his family, it killed something in him. His mother Lucia held things together somehow. She had 3 surviving children and whatever money Fermo had managed to save. Not much, enough to survive. enough to get young Michelangelo an education, though whether he attended any formal school is unclear. What we know is that by 1584, when he was 13, Lucia arranged an apprenticeship for her eldest son. 4 years with Simone Peterzano, a Milanese painter who described himself in the apprenticeship contract as a pupil of Titian. This was the path for aspiring artists. You apprenticed young. You learned by doing. You copied your master's style until you developed your own. Peterzano was a fresco painter, competent but not brilliant, working in the Mannerist style that dominated late 16th century Italy. Elongated figures, artificial poses, elegant but emotionally cool. Milan was full of his work, religious scenes painted on church walls. And here's what's interesting. Caravaggio never mastered fresco painting. Never. Despite 4 years watching Peterzano work, he apparently never absorbed or cared about the technique. He was a terrible student by all accounts, not because he couldn't learn, but because he fundamentally disagreed with what he was being taught. Mannerism was about refinement, about idealization. You made figures more beautiful than life, more graceful, more perfect. You composed carefully, sketched extensively, planned every element. Peterzano would have taught all of this, and Caravaggio absorbed enough to understand the rules of painting, the technical fundamentals. But he rejected the philosophy completely. He'd seen too much death, too much suffering. The plague had shown him what bodies actually looked like in extremis. Idealization was a lie, and he had no patience for lies. What he did absorb was a thorough knowledge of Renaissance masters. Art historians can trace influences from Savoldo, Moretto, Lotto, Palma Vecchio. He studied Titian's use of colour, Giorgione's atmospheric effects, Leonardo's dramatic compositions. He learned by looking, by analysing how the greats achieved their effects. And he learned something else, something revolutionary. He learned to paint without preparatory drawings. This sounds technical, but it was radical. Every artist made drawings first. You sketched the composition, worked out the figures, planned the lighting, then you transferred the drawing to canvas and painted. Caravaggio skipped this entirely. X-ray scans of his paintings confirm it. No underdrawings, nothing. He painted directly, working from life, making decisions as he went. This gave his work an immediacy, a sense of capturing a real moment that nothing else in Italian art possessed. But it also made him incredibly difficult to categorize, impossible to fit into the established system of how painting was supposed to work. In 1584, the same year he began his apprenticeship, Lucia died. Michelangelo was 13. His mother had been the one stable presence after the plague, and now she was gone too. The details of her death are lost, but he was suddenly an orphan, with siblings to look after and an inheritance to divide. The records show he left most of the money to his younger brother and sister. He took his share, cut ties with them, and never looked back. By the time he was 19, he'd burned through his inheritance. Gone. Whatever money his father had saved, whatever his mother had left him, Michelangelo spent it within a year. The period from 1588 to 1592 is murky. One biographer suggests he visited Venice, which would explain some influences in his later work. Others think he stayed in Lombardy, picking up whatever work he could find. What we know for certain is that in 1592, following what contemporary documents vaguely call certain quarrels, including an incident where he apparently wounded a police officer, 21-year-old Caravaggio fled Milan for Rome. He arrived, according to early biographer Giulio Mancini, naked and extremely needy, without fixed address and without provision short of money. Broke alone, with no connections and no commissions, in the most competitive art market in Italy. Rome in 1592 was undergoing a religious revival under Pope Clement VIII. Churches everywhere needed decoration. The Catholic Counter-Reformation was in full swing, and art was one of its weapons. Paintings to inspire faith, to counter Protestant criticism of Catholic excess, to make the invisible mysteries of faith visible and emotionally overwhelming. Opportunity existed for talented painters, but Rome was also flooded with aspiring artists, all competing for the same commissions, all trying to catch the eye of the same wealthy patrons. Breaking through required either extraordinary talent or extraordinary luck. Caravaggio had neither yet. He took lodgings first with Lorenzo Siciliano, a Sicilian painter whose work has been almost entirely lost to history. Then he moved in briefly with a priest named Pandolfo Pucci, an arrangement he complained about bitterly because Pucci apparently fed him nothing but salad. Lettuce for breakfast, lunch and dinner. Caravaggio was not a man who tolerated discomfort well. He moved again, this time joining the studio of Antiveduto Grammatica, another painter whose name suggests more success than his actual career delivered. These were the grunt years. Caravaggio wasn't painting his own work. He was an assistant, a hired hand. He painted backgrounds for other artists' compositions. He ran errands, he mixed paints. The work was tedious and poorly paid, and he was surrounded by other aspiring painters, all in the same situation, all desperate for the break that would launch their careers. The competition was vicious. Artists lived in close quarters, socialized in the same circles, competed for the same jobs. Friendships formed and dissolved based on who was rising and who was falling. Through connections from Peterzano, probably letters of introduction, Caravaggio managed to land a position in the workshop of Giuseppe Cesari, known as Cavaliere d'Arpino. This was a step up. Cesari was successful, prominent, connected. He painted quickly and with panache, sometimes working in full dress, complete with lace cuffs and sword. He ran his workshop like an efficient business, almost an assembly line, and he put Caravaggio in charge of a specific task: flowers and fruit. That was it. Caravaggio's job was to paint all the decorative still life elements in Cesari's larger compositions. Baskets of fruit, flower arrangements, the pretty details that made paintings look luxurious. It was mind-numbing work, and the pay was terrible. Caravaggio later complained he was essentially paid in lettuce, which might have been literally true, given how workshop assistants were sometimes compensated with room and board rather than actual money. But here's what happened during those months of painting endless grapes and apples. Caravaggio learned to observe, really observe, the way light hits a piece of fruit, the subtle colour variations in a leaf, the texture of skin, the softness of petals. He painted these objects with an intensity and realism that his contemporaries found almost disturbing. Too real, too physical, nothing idealized or prettified. In 1594, Caravaggio left Cesari's workshop and started working for himself. He painted small works for the open market, genre scenes, self-portraits, and evocative pictures of young boys that would become his signature style. These early paintings show him working out his technique, experimenting with light and composition. Boy Peeling a Fruit, probably his earliest surviving work, shows a young man concentrating on removing an apple's skin. That's it. No grand narrative, no religious theme, just a moment of quiet concentration, rendered with absolute precision. Boy with a basket of fruit took the still life skills he'd developed under Cesari and combined them with figure painting. A youth offers a basket, overflowing with grapes, peaches, pomegranates. The fruit is almost aggressively real, every blemish and imperfection visible. Nothing idealized. This was life as it actually looked, not as refined artistic convention said it should look. And young sick Bacchus, supposedly a self-portrait painted during recovery from a serious illness, shows a pallid youth crowned with wilting vine leaves, holding grapes, looking directly at the viewer with haunted eyes. It's unsettling, not beautiful in any conventional sense, real. These paintings didn't make Caravaggio rich. He sold them for almost nothing, but they got him noticed, and that's what mattered. In 1594, he painted something that changed everything. The card sharp shows a naive young man being cheated at cards by two con artists. One signals the victim's hand to his accomplice, who has extra cards tucked into his belt. The psychological complexity is extraordinary for such an early work. You can see the victim's innocent concentration, the cheater's practiced deception, the entire drama playing out in a single frozen moment. It was copied numerous times almost immediately. Everyone wanted versions of it. The card sharps caught the attention of Cardinal Francesco Maria del Monte, one of Rome's most important art patrons. Del Monte was wealthy, cultured, and genuinely passionate about painting. He collected art, supported artists, and had the connections to make careers. He bought the card sharps. He bought the fortune teller, another two-figure composition showing a Romani girl reading a boy's palm while stealthily removing his ring. And Del Monte invited Caravaggio to join his household at Palazzo Madama. This was the breakthrough. Suddenly Caravaggio wasn't a struggling workshop assistant. He was the protégé of one of Rome's most powerful men, living in a palace, with access to commissions that could make him famous. He was 23 years old, and his real career was about to begin. But everything that made Caravaggio's art revolutionary, the darkness, the realism, the emotional intensity, came from the same place as his demons. The plague had taught him that death was arbitrary and grotesque. His years of poverty had taught him that the world was violent and unfair, and his temperament, whatever genetic inheritance or psychological damage he carried, made him incapable of controlling his rage. The success was coming. The violence was coming too, and in the end, they'd destroy each other. But first, he had paintings to make that would change art forever, and a patron powerful enough to protect him from the consequences of who he was becoming. Del Monte understood what he'd acquired. Not just a talented painter, but someone who could revolutionize how religious stories were told. The cardinal's household at Palazzo Madama became Caravaggio's new world. Elegant rooms, intellectual conversations, musical performances, and most importantly, a steady income. Del Monte paid him well and gave him time to develop his craft without the desperate scramble for survival that had defined his first years in Rome. The paintings from this period show Caravaggio exploring new territory. The musicians shows four young men with instruments, sheets of music, grapes and wine. It's sensual, ambiguous in ways that would have appealed to Del Monte's sophisticated circle. The lute player features a young man tuning his instrument, surrounded by music scores and flowers. These weren't just portraits. They were invitations into intimate moments, carefully staged but feeling spontaneous. But Del Monte wanted more than pretty boys with instruments. He was deeply connected to Rome's ecclesiastical power structure, and he knew the real money, the real prestige, came from public commissions, church decorations, altarpieces, work that thousands would see, not just private collectors. In 1599, Del Monte arranged something that would make Caravaggio's career. The Contarelli Chapel in the Church of San Luigi dei Francesi needed paintings depicting the life of St. Matthew. The chapel had been endowed decades earlier by a French cardinal, Matteo Contarelli, who'd left money for its decoration. But the original artist had died, and the project had stalled. Now it was available. Caravaggio got the commission. 2 large canvases for the side walls, the calling of St. Matthew and the martyrdom of St. Matthew. These would be his first major public works, visible to everyone who entered the church. Success here meant more commissions. Failure meant obscurity. He approached them differently than any religious painter before him. Most artists of the period set biblical scenes in idealized classical settings. Marble columns, flowing robes, everyone beautiful and noble looking. Caravaggio put his saints in what looked like contemporary Rome. The calling of St. Matthew shows Christ entering a dark room where men are counting money around a table. The lighting is dramatic, almost theatrical. A shaft of light cuts through the darkness, and Christ's hand points toward Matthew. It's the same gesture from Michelangelo's creation of Adam on the Sistine Chapel ceiling, but everything else is different. These aren't idealized figures. They're dressed like Romans from 1600. One man wears a feathered hat. Another leans forward, squinting. Matthew points at himself as if asking, "Me?" The moment feels immediate, real, like something happening now rather than 2,000 years ago. The martyrdom of St. Matthew is even more intense. The saint lies on the ground while a muscular executioner prepares to strike. Bodies twist and recoil in horror. A boy screams. An angel reaches down from heaven, holding a palm branch, the symbol of martyrdom. The violence is visceral. This isn't sanitized religious art, it's brutal and human. When the paintings were unveiled in 1600, the reaction was immediate and divided. Some viewers were horrified. Saints shouldn't look like street people. Religious art should elevate, not reflect the grime of daily life. The darkness was oppressive. The realism was inappropriate. But younger artists were electrified. Here was someone showing that religious stories could be told with the same emotional intensity as secular drama. That sacred moments could feel present rather than distant. The technique, the lighting, the psychological complexity, all of it was revolutionary. Caravaggio had arrived. At 29, he was suddenly one of Rome's most talked about painters. Commissions started coming. The Cirasi Chapel in Santa Maria del Popolo wanted two paintings, the Conversion of St. Paul and the Crucifixion of St. Peter. Both delivered in 1601, both showing Caravaggio pushing his dramatic style further. The Conversion of St. Paul is particularly striking. Saul, later Paul, has fallen from his horse on the road to Damascus. He lies on his back, arms outstretched, blinded by divine light. The horse looms massive above him, its hindquarters dominating the composition. A groom holds the animal steady. That's it. No angels, no heavenly hosts, just a man on the ground, experiencing a moment of spiritual transformation so intense, it's knocked him flat. The light source is invisible, but its effects are everywhere, carving form from darkness. The Crucifixion of St. Peter shows the apostle being raised on his cross, upside down. As tradition says, he requested, because he felt unworthy to die the same way as Christ. The executioners strain with the weight. Peter's face shows not fear, but resignation, even defiance. These are working men doing a brutal job. The saint is old, his body showing age. Nothing is prettified. Caravaggio was making art that forced viewers to confront the physical reality of religious stories. Martyrdom hurt. Conversion was disorienting. Faith existed in the real world, among real bodies, not in some ethereal realm of perfect forms. But success didn't calm him. If anything, it made things worse. He had money now, status, but the violence that had always lurked beneath the surface kept breaking through. Rome's streets were dangerous. Everyone carried weapons. Brawls were common, but Caravaggio took it to another level. His police record from this period reads like a chronicle of escalating rage. November 1600, he attacked a nobleman with a club. April 1601, questioned about carrying a sword without permission. May 1604, arrested for throwing a plate of artichokes at a waiter. October 1604, arrested for throwing stones at police. These weren't isolated incidents, they were patterns. He dressed in black, deliberately cultivating a dangerous image. He carried swords and daggers openly, daring authorities to challenge him. He had a black dog he called Crow. He hung out with other painters, poets, prostitutes and criminals in the taverns around Piazza Navona. The group called themselves the Virtuosi, and their motto was Nec spe, nec metu, without hope, without fear. It was posturing, but it was also genuine. Caravaggio seemed to actively court danger. His patrons kept intervening. Del Monte, the Colonna family, connected to Caravaggio through his mother's side. They had the influence to make charges disappear, to smooth over incidents that would have landed anyone else in prison. But each intervention required more effort. Each incident was slightly worse than the last. In July 1605, Caravaggio seriously injured a notary named Mariano Pasqualone with a sword, slashing his face and head. This was over Lena, a woman who modelled for Caravaggio and was probably his lover. Pasqualone had insulted her or tried to claim her or something. The details are murky. What's clear is that Caravaggio's response was immediate and violent. He had to flee Rome for 3 weeks, while his patrons worked to cover it up. The paintings from this period grow darker, not just in technique but in subject matter. The Death of the Virgin, painted around 1606 for a church altarpiece, caused a scandal. Mary lies on a simple bed, her body swollen, her feet bare and dirty. She looks like a corpse because she was modelled on a corpse, specifically, according to rumour, a prostitute who drowned in the Tiber. The apostles surrounding her are grief-stricken, but there's no transcendence, no angels, no heaven opening, just death and mourning. The church that commissioned it refused to accept it. Too realistic, too disturbing. It showed the Mother of God as an actual dead woman, rather than as someone ascending to eternal glory. Another patron bought it instead, and it became famous precisely because of the controversy. Caravaggio was painting what he knew. Death wasn't beautiful or noble, it was ugly and final. His childhood memories of plague victims, of his father and grandfather dying, all of it poured into these works. The realism everyone praised was partly technical skill, but it was also psychological compulsion. He couldn't paint things as they weren't, and the violence kept escalating. By spring 1606, Caravaggio was involved in a running feud with a man named Ranuccio Tomassoni. Tomassoni was from a wealthy family, connected, dangerous in his own right. They'd clashed multiple times. There were insults, threats, smaller physical confrontations. On May 28, 1606, it came to a head. Campo Marzio, an area near Piazza Navona. The exact details are disputed. Some sources say it was a duel. Others say it started as a fight over a tennis match and gambling debts. What's certain is that Caravaggio and Tomassoni met with several companions each, and swords were drawn. The fight was brutal. Caravaggio's brother was there. So were several others. In the chaos, Caravaggio's sword found Tomassoni's femoral artery, the major blood vessel in the thigh. The wound was catastrophic. Tomassoni bled out in minutes. Caravaggio was injured too, a head wound, but he survived. And when he realised what he'd done, that he'd killed a connected man from a powerful family, he fled. This wasn't something his patrons could fix. Tomassoni's family wanted justice. Pope Paul V issued a death sentence, not just imprisonment, but execution. And here's where it gets particularly grim. The sentence included a bando capitale, a public bounty. Anyone who recognised Caravaggio anywhere in papal territory could legally kill him and claim a reward. His head could be brought in for payment. At 34, at the height of his artistic powers, Caravaggio had to run. He left Rome in June 1606 and would never return. The next 4 years would be a desperate flight through southern Italy, Malta and Sicily. He'd keep painting, some of his greatest works still ahead of him. But he'd be painting as a fugitive, always looking over his shoulder, always one step ahead of the death sentence hanging over him. The success he'd fought so hard to achieve was suddenly meaningless. All that mattered now was survival. The darkness in his paintings wasn't metaphorical anymore. It was literal, closing in from every direction, and there was no light strong enough to hold it back. Naples saved him, at least temporarily. The city was outside papal jurisdiction, part of the Spanish Empire, and it was massive. 250,000 people crammed into streets that made Rome look orderly. If you wanted to disappear, Naples was the place. Caravaggio arrived sometime in late summer or early fall of 1606, probably travelling south along the coast, avoiding main roads, keeping his head down. He had contacts there through his Roman patrons. The Colonna family, who'd protected him before, had influence in Naples. They helped him find lodging, introduced him to potential patrons, and remarkably, despite having a death warrant on his head, despite being a fugitive, Caravaggio kept working. The commissions came almost immediately. Naples was hungry for art. Churches were being built and renovated. Wealthy families wanted altarpieces, and Caravaggio's reputation had preceded him. Everyone knew his style, the dramatic light, the shocking realism. They wanted that. His first major Neapolitan work was The 7 Works of Mercy, painted for a charitable confraternity in late 1606 or early 1607. It's an extraordinary painting, maybe 10 feet tall, crammed with figures performing the 7 acts of Christian charity all at once in a single chaotic scene. Feeding the hungry, clothing the naked, sheltering the homeless, visiting prisoners, caring for the sick, burying the dead, giving drink to the thirsty. All happening simultaneously in what looks like a dark Naples alley. The composition is compressed, claustrophobic. Bodies press against each other. A woman nurses an old man through prison bars. A corpse is carried by torchlight. A knight shares his cloak with a half-naked beggar. Above it all, angels swoop down, but they're not ethereal. They're solid, muscular, almost falling into the scene below. It's chaos, but controlled chaos. Every element serves the whole. The light cuts through the darkness in shafts, highlighting faces, hands, gestures of mercy. Naples itself is in the painting. The crowded streets, the poverty, the desperation. Caravaggio wasn't idealizing. He was showing the city as it was, brutal and beautiful at the same time. The confraternity loved it. So did everyone else who saw it. Suddenly Caravaggio was Naples' most sought-after painter. More commissions followed. The Flagellation of Christ, the Crucifixion of St. Andrew, Madonna of the Rosary. He was working at an incredible pace, producing major works in months. But the pressure was constant. He was still a fugitive. The death sentence hadn't been lifted, and Naples, for all its protection, wasn't entirely safe. Papal agents moved through the city. Bounty hunters operated everywhere. Caravaggio had to be careful, had to keep moving, couldn't settle. The paintings from this period show it. The violence becomes more explicit. The flagellation shows Christ tied to a column, 3 men beating him with savage efficiency. No glory, no transcendence, just pain. The figures are massive, cramming the frame, pressing in on Christ from all sides. The light picks out every muscle, every grimace, every detail of suffering. St. Andrew's crucifixion is worse. The old apostle is being hauled up onto an X-shaped cross by executioners who treat it like routine labour. Andrew's face shows resignation, maybe even relief. Death is coming. That's certain. The uncertainty is in the waiting. These aren't devotional images meant to inspire worship. They're confrontations. They force you to witness suffering without flinching, without the comfort of knowing it leads somewhere better. Caravaggio was painting what he knew. Pain, mortality, the moment before everything ends. He stayed in Naples for 10 months, maybe a year, long enough to establish himself, to make money, to build a reputation that extended beyond Rome. But not long enough to feel safe, because safety wasn't possible. Not with that death sentence, not with Tomasoni's family still demanding justice. So in mid-1607, Caravaggio made a decision. He'd go to Malta. The Knights of St. John, the military religious order that controlled the island, had significant political influence. If he could become a knight, if he could secure their protection, maybe he could negotiate a pardon. Maybe he could go home. The journey to Malta took him through Sicily first, though records from this period are sparse. By July 1607, he was in Valletta, Malta's capital, meeting with Alof de Wignacourt, the Grand Master of the Knights. Wignacourt was in his 50s, a French nobleman who'd risen through the order's ranks. He was cultured, interested in art, and shrewd enough to recognise what having Caravaggio as the order's official painter could mean. Prestige. status, proof that the knights were patrons of the highest artistic achievement. Caravaggio painted Wignacourt's portrait, the Grand Master in full armour, standing with a young page beside him. It's a formal piece, more restrained than Caravaggio's usual work, but still masterful. The armour gleams. The face is dignified but human, showing age and authority without idealization. Wignacourt looks like what he was, a warrior administrator carrying enormous responsibility. The Grand Master was impressed enough to commission more works, and impressed enough to do something almost unprecedented. He fast-tracked Caravaggio's admission to the order as a Knight of Obedience, a lower rank than Knights of Justice, but still significant. In July 1608, after less than a year in Malta, Caravaggio was formally inducted. It must have felt like salvation. The ceremony, the robes, the recognition. Fra Michelangelo, they called him now. Brother Michelangelo. He'd gone from fugitive to knight in 12 months. The death sentence might be lifted. Rome might be possible again. But there was a catch, a massive one. To become a knight, you needed to prove noble birth and good moral character. Caravaggio's family had minor noble connections through his mother's side, enough to satisfy the first requirement. But moral character? With a murder conviction and a death sentence? That was harder to explain. The order either didn't know about the Rome killing or chose to overlook it. Wignacourt wanted Caravaggio's paintings badly enough to bend the rules. Or maybe they knew and thought it didn't matter. Knights killed people. That was part of the job. As long as Caravaggio could paint, his past could be ignored. The major commission came quickly. The oratory of St. John's Co-Cathedral needed an altarpiece. The subject? The beheading of John the Baptist, patron saint of the knights. It would be the largest painting in the church, the centerpiece, the work that every knight would see when they gathered for prayers. Caravaggio delivered something nobody expected. The beheading of St. John the Baptist is enormous, over 12 feet tall and 17 feet wide. It's the only painting he ever signed, his name written in the blood pooling beneath John's severed neck. F. Michelangelo. Brother Michelangelo. The scene is stark, a prison courtyard. John lies on the ground, already dying, his throat half cut. The executioner reaches for his knife to finish the job. A servant woman holds a platter to receive the head. 2 prisoners watch from a barred window. Salome, who demanded John's death, stands at a distance, hands clasped, almost surprised by what she's set in motion. The space is vast and empty. The figures occupy maybe a third of the canvas. The rest is darkness and stone walls. The light is cold, revealing without offering hope. This is execution as bureaucracy, death as procedure. The executioner isn't monstrous, he's just doing his job. The violence is matter-of-fact, almost boring in its inevitability. Critics consider it one of the greatest paintings in Western art. The composition, the light, the psychological complexity, but it's also deeply unsettling. There's no redemption here, no promise of heaven, just a man dying in a prison yard while others watch. Caravaggio painted himself into it. Some scholars believe he's one of the prisoners in the window, watching his own execution by proxy. Or maybe he's the executioner, acknowledging what he'd done to Tomasoni. The painting is confession and prophecy at once. This is what killing looks like. This is what it costs. The knights loved it. It was installed with great ceremony. Caravaggio was at the height of his success again. Protected, honoured, working. He'd escaped Rome, survived Naples, and reinvented himself in Malta. Everything was finally working out. Then 2 months later, he destroyed it all. Again. August 18th, 1608. A fight broke out. The details are murky, but it involved another knight, Fra Giovanni Rodomonte Roero, an organist at the church. They were at Roero's house. Words were exchanged, then violence. Caravaggio smashed Roero's door, attacked him with a weapon, seriously wounded him. The exact cause is unknown. Some sources suggest it was personal. Others hint at political intrigue within the order. What's certain is that Caravaggio, a knight for barely a month, had assaulted a superior officer on his own property. He was arrested immediately, imprisoned in Fort San Angelo, a massive fortress overlooking Valletta's harbour. The charges were serious: attempted murder, carrying weapons without permission, assault on a knight. The punishment would be severe, possibly execution. The order didn't tolerate this kind of behaviour, especially from someone they'd just inducted. Caravaggio didn't wait to find out. On October 6th, less than 2 months after his arrest, he escaped. How remains a mystery. Fort St. Angelo was considered impregnable. High walls, guards, no obvious weak points. But Caravaggio got out, possibly with help from sympathetic knights or through bribes. He fled Malta entirely, crossing to Sicily on a boat in the middle of the night. Behind him, the order moved quickly to erase their mistake. On December 1st, an effigy of Caravaggio was brought before the knights, assembled in the very oratory where his beheading hung on the wall. The effigy was formally stripped of its robes. The ceremonial degradation was complete. Caravaggio was declared a foul and rotten member, expelled from the order forever. The man who'd been Fra Michelangelo for 3 months was now nothing again. Worse than nothing, he'd been a fugitive from Rome. Now he was a fugitive from Rome and a disgraced knight expelled from Malta. The death sentence still hung over him, and he'd just made more powerful enemies. Sicily became his next refuge. Syracuse first, then Messina, then Palermo. He kept painting because that's all he could do. Keep working, keep moving, keep trying to earn enough money and goodwill to negotiate his way back to Rome. The Sicilian paintings are darker still. The burial of St. Lucy shows the saint's corpse being lowered into a grave while mourners huddle in shadow. The grave itself dominates the composition, a black void opening in the earth. The grave diggers are enormous, dwarfing the mourners, making death itself seem like the only thing that matters, the only certainty. The raising of Lazarus, painted in Messina, is equally grim. Lazarus is being pulled from his tomb, his body rigid, his face showing not joy at resurrection but confusion, maybe horror. He'd been dead. Now he's not. What does that feel like? The painting doesn't suggest it's a blessing. Caravaggio moved between cities, staying weeks or months, painting commissions, then moving on. Sicily was Spanish territory like Naples, outside papal reach, but it wasn't safe. Rumours followed him. Enemies tracked him. The knights had agents everywhere. Tomasoni's family hadn't forgotten. In October 1609, he was attacked outside a tavern in Naples, where he'd returned after leaving Sicily. The assailants were never identified officially, but the speculation was they were connected to Malta, sent to punish him for his escape and disgrace. They slashed his face, leaving wounds so severe that early reports said he'd been killed. He survived, but the damage was permanent. His face was scarred, disfigured. Contemporary descriptions say he was almost unrecognisable afterward. He recovered slowly, hiding in Naples, protected by the Colonna family again. But he was desperate now, desperate to get back to Rome, to end the exile that had consumed 4 years of his life. His patrons were negotiating with the Pope, working toward a pardon. Cardinal Gonzaga was involved. The Colonna family was pushing. Word came that it might be possible. If Caravaggio presented himself properly, if he brought paintings as gifts, if he showed contrition, the death sentence might be commuted. In July 1610, he boarded a felucca, a small boat, heading north along the coast toward Rome. He brought paintings with him, works meant to secure his pardon. Everything he'd suffered for, everything he'd painted in exile, it all came down to this journey. He never made it. The boat landed at Palo, about 30 miles from Rome. Spanish soldiers arrested him there, a case of mistaken identity. By the time they realised their error and released him, the boat had left, taking his paintings with it. Caravaggio tried to catch up. He travelled on foot in the brutal July heat, following the coast north to Porto Ercole, but he was already sick. The face wounds had never properly healed. fever set in, maybe malaria, maybe an infection. He died in Porto Ercole on July 18th, 1610. He was 38 years old. 3 days later, the pardon arrived in Rome. Respond only with the script. The news of his death spread slowly. Porto Ercole was a small garrison town, not a cultural centre. Nobody there knew who he was, just another traveller who died of fever in the summer heat. His body was buried in a common grave, unmarked, unrecorded. The paintings he'd carried disappeared. Maybe stolen from the boat, maybe lost, nobody knows. Back in Rome, the arts world learned what had happened within weeks. The reaction was complicated. Caravaggio had been the most influential painter of his generation, but he'd also been a murderer, a fugitive, a man whose violence had finally caught up with him. Some mourned, others shrugged. That's what happens when you live like that. But his work remained, and that's what matters for understanding what came next. The paintings Caravaggio created in his final 4 years of exile, they're extraordinary. Not despite the circumstances, but because of them. Every canvas from Naples, Malta, Sicily, the return to Naples, they all carry the weight of what he was living through. The isolation, the paranoia, the knowledge that he might never make it home. Look at the beheading of St. John the Baptist again. It's the only painting he ever signed. He wrote his name in the saint's blood pooling on the ground. Not at the bottom corner like a normal signature. In the blood, as if the painting itself was bleeding his identity onto the canvas. That painting was commissioned by the Knights of Malta as an altarpiece for their oratory. It measures over 12 feet wide. The largest work he ever created. And it's about execution. About a man being killed for political reasons, his head demanded by a ruler who needed to satisfy someone else's vengeance. The parallels weren't subtle. Caravaggio was painting his own situation. A man condemned, a death ordered, a life ended to satisfy justice, or revenge or politics. The painting is almost unbearably dark. The figures emerge from shadow like ghosts. John's body is sprawled on the ground, the executioner reaching for a knife to finish severing the head. The witnesses watch from behind bars, as if they're already imprisoned themselves. Caravaggio painted this while he was technically safe in Malta, protected by the knights, even made a member of their order. But the painting shows he knew it wouldn't last. He was already painting his own death. The attack in Naples in 1609 changed everything. His face was slashed so badly that people who'd known him didn't recognize him afterward. The wounds were deep, disfiguring. They never fully healed. For a painter whose work depended on observing the world, on seeing clearly, this was catastrophic. Contemporary accounts describe him after the attack as almost unrecognizable. The scars ran across his face. His features were distorted, and there was something else, a change in his behaviour. He became more reclusive, more paranoid, more convinced that he was being hunted. He was probably right. The knights had agents throughout Italian territories. Tomasoni's family hadn't forgotten. The attack in Naples might have been random violence, but it might also have been a deliberate attempt to kill him that simply failed. He couldn't know. That uncertainty must have been worse than certainty. The paintings from this final period in Naples are the darkest he ever made. The denial of St. Peter shows Peter refusing to admit he knows Christ, his hand raised in rejection, his face twisted with fear and shame. It's a painting about betrayal, about cowardice, about denying connection to save yourself. The martyrdom of St. Ursula shows the moment a Hun king shoots an arrow into Ursula's chest at point-blank range. She looks down at the wound, surprised more than anything. The king watches her reaction with something like satisfaction. It's intimate violence, personal, the kind where the killer wants to see what they've done. These aren't heroic martyrdoms. They're not about faith triumphing over death. They're about the moment of violence itself, the shock, the physical reality, the way death comes suddenly and doesn't care about meaning or redemption. Caravaggio was painting what he knew: violence, fear, the knowledge that death could come at any moment, and probably would. The decision to try returning to Rome in July 1610 was desperate. He'd been negotiating through intermediaries for months. Cardinal Gonzaga was involved. The Colonna family, who'd protected him throughout his exile, were pushing for a pardon. Word came that Pope Paul V might be willing to commute the death sentence if Caravaggio approached properly, if he showed contrition, if he brought gifts. So he gathered paintings, works he'd created specifically for this purpose. We don't know exactly which ones, probably some of the smaller devotional pieces he'd been making in Naples, maybe portraits. He loaded them onto a felucca, a small coastal vessel, and set out north toward Rome. He never should have stopped at Palo. It was a minor port about 30 miles south of Rome. The boat pulled in for some reason, supplies maybe, or to wait for better weather. Spanish soldiers were stationed there. They arrested Caravaggio. Why? The records don't say clearly. Mistaken identity is the usual explanation. They thought he was someone else, or maybe someone recognized him, knew about the death sentence, thought they could claim the bounty. Either way, by the time they realized their mistake and released him, the boat had left. With his paintings, everything he'd brought to negotiate his pardon, gone. He tried to catch up, started travelling on foot along the coast, heading north to Porto Ercole, where the boat was supposed to stop next. But it was July, the heat was brutal, and he was already sick. The face wounds had never properly healed. He probably had chronic infections. The fever that killed him might have been malaria, common in coastal Italy during summer, or it might have been an infection from the wounds finally turning septic, or something else entirely. The cause of death wasn't recorded. He made it to Porto Ercole, collapsed there, died within days, alone in a garrison town where nobody knew his name. 3 days later, the official pardon arrived in Rome. That timing has haunted everyone who studied Caravaggio's life. 3 days. If the Spanish soldiers hadn't arrested him, if the boat had waited, if he'd been just slightly faster, he would have made it. The pardon would have come through. He could have returned to Rome, resumed his career, lived out his life, painting the commissions that would have flooded in. But that's not what happened. What happened is he died alone, an unknown in a place that meant nothing to him, and his body was thrown into an unmarked grave with other poor travellers who'd died that summer. His death didn't stop his influence. That's the strange thing. Caravaggism was already spreading across Europe before he died. Artists in Naples, in Spain, in the Netherlands, they were all copying his style, the dramatic lighting, the realistic figures, the dark backgrounds, the psychological intensity. Within a decade of his death, you could find Caravaggesque paintings all over Catholic Europe. Orazio Gentileschi brought the style to England. Artemisia Gentileschi, Orazio's daughter, became one of the most successful painters in Italy, working in a style directly descended from Caravaggio's innovations. Georges de la Tour in France created candlelit scenes that owed everything to Caravaggio's tenebrism. The influence wasn't always acknowledged. By the middle of the 17th century, tastes had shifted. Baroque style was evolving towards something lighter, more decorative. Caravaggio's darkness fell out of fashion. Critics like Giovanni Bellori, writing in the 1670s, condemned Caravaggio's realism as vulgar, his models as inappropriate, his lack of classical education as a fatal flaw. Bellori praised Caravaggio's technical skill, but argued that his insistence on painting directly from life, without idealization, without reference to classical models, had led him into error. Real life wasn't beautiful enough for art, Bellori argued. Art should improve on nature, not just copy it. This view dominated for centuries. Caravaggio was remembered as an important but flawed artist, someone who'd had natural talent but lacked the education and temperament to achieve true greatness. His violent life was used as evidence of his flawed character. A good artist would have been a good person. Caravaggio clearly wasn't. His paintings were scattered. Some were lost, some were damaged. Many were in private collections where they couldn't be studied. The Death of the Virgin, rejected by its original commissioners for indecency, ended up in the collection of the Duke of Mantua, then was sold to Charles I of England, then ended up in France. The Contarelli Chapel paintings stayed in Rome, but they were difficult to see properly. The chapel was dark. The paintings were high on the walls. It wasn't until the 20th century that Caravaggio's reputation was fully restored. Art historian Roberto Longhi organised a major exhibition in 1951 that brought together Caravaggio's works and those of his followers. Suddenly, scholars could see the scope of his achievement, the way he'd transformed painting, the generations of artists who'd learned from him. Modern technology helped too. X-rays revealed how Caravaggio worked, painting directly onto the canvas, without preparatory drawings. Infrared photography showed the adjustments he made as he painted, the way he'd move a hand or adjust a face to get the exact effect he wanted. Restoration cleaned centuries of dirt and varnish from the paintings, revealing colours and details that had been hidden. And scholars started asking different questions. Instead of judging Caravaggio by the standards of classical idealism, they looked at what he was actually trying to do. Instead of seeing his violence as proof of moral failure, they examined the context, the honour culture of Renaissance Italy, the way violence was normalised, the fact that lots of artists got into fights. Caravaggio just took it further. His sexuality became a topic of serious scholarly investigation. The homoerotic content in many of his early paintings, the beautiful young men posed provocatively, this wasn't just aesthetic choice. It reflected something about Caravaggio himself, his desires, his relationships. The models he used were identified. Mario Minetti, the young Sicilian who appeared in so many early paintings. Philide Melandroni, the courtesan who modelled for Martha, for Judith, for the Magdalene. Lina Antonietti, another courtesan whose relationship with Caravaggio led to the attack on the notary in 1605. These weren't just anonymous faces, they were real people who mattered to him, and scholars started looking at the exile paintings with fresh eyes, recognizing the psychological depth, the way Caravaggio was working through his own situation, the self-portraits hidden in crowds, his face as Goliath's severed head held by David, his face as Lazarus being raised from the dead, his face in the witnesses watching John the Baptist's execution. He kept painting himself into his own nightmares, working through the trauma, trying to understand what was happening to him. The final question, the one that haunts everyone who studies this period, is whether Caravaggio wanted to die, whether the return to Rome was a genuine attempt to salvage his life or a kind of death wish, whether he'd given up. The evidence points both ways. He was still painting, still trying to negotiate a pardon, still making plans, but he was also painting increasingly dark subjects, increasingly personal expressions of despair, and he kept putting himself in dangerous situations, attacking the knights in Malta, returning to Naples where his enemies could find him, trying to travel back to Rome despite knowing the risks. Maybe he couldn't help it. Maybe the violence, the paranoia, the inability to stay out of trouble, maybe that was just who he was. Or maybe the trauma from the plague, the murder, the exile, maybe it had broken something in him that couldn't be repaired. What we know for certain is that his work from those final 4 years represents some of the most psychologically intense painting ever created. Each canvas is a window into a mind under extreme pressure. Fear, guilt, desperation, rage, all of it channeled into images of saints and martyrs and biblical scenes that somehow contain everything he was feeling. That's what makes Caravaggio matter. Not just the technical innovation, not just the influence on other artists, but the way he used painting to process his own life, to make sense of violence and loss and fear, to create beauty out of darkness. He died before he could find redemption, before the pardon could reach him, before he could paint his way back to Rome. But the paintings remain, and they still speak. The death was absurd, meaningless. A man who'd survived a murder charge, escaped prison, lived through knife fights and feuds, who'd created some of the greatest paintings in Western art while running from execution, died on a beach from fever. That's it. No dramatic final painting, no deathbed confession, no reconciliation. Just sickness and sand in the end. The details are sparse because almost nobody witnessed it. What we know comes from a letter written by someone who wasn't there, reporting what others had told him. Caravaggio arrived at Porto Ercole sometime in mid-July 1610. He was sick, maybe already feverish. Maybe the illness started on the boat. The felucca he'd been travelling on had been seized by Spanish authorities at Parlo, just north of Rome. They arrested him. Mistaken identity, probably. Some criminal they were looking for. By the time they realised their mistake and released him, the boat had sailed. With all his belongings, his paintings, the canvases he was bringing to Rome as gifts to secure his pardon. So he followed on foot, or found another boat. The sources aren't clear. Porto Ercole was Spanish territory, technically safe, but it was July, the height of summer, and the town was basically a fortress on a rocky promontory. Hot, exposed, no shelter. He collapsed somewhere on the beach or in the town. The fever took hold. There was no doctor, or if there was, they couldn't help him. Malaria, probably, or some other disease carried by mosquitoes in the marshes. Maybe dysentery, maybe simple exhaustion combined with infection from an old wound. His body had been through too much. He died on July 18th or 19th. We're not even sure which day. The records say July 18th, but there's confusion about dates. He was 38 years old. 38. Think about that. Everything he accomplished, all those paintings, the revolution in art, the influence that would shape centuries of European painting, all of it compressed into about 15 years of actual working life. From 1594, when he painted the card sharps, to 1610. 15 years. And for 4 of those years, he was on the run, painting in Naples, Malta, Sicily, Naples again, creating masterpieces while looking over his shoulder, while knowing that anyone could recognize him and claim the bounty, while slowly losing his mind to paranoia and fear and whatever it was that drove him to keep picking fights, even when he had everything to lose. The last paintings show it. The exhaustion, the darkness getting darker, the martyrdom of St. Ursula from early 1610 might be his final work. Ursula shot with an arrow by the king of the Huns, the arrow piercing her chest. Caravaggio painted himself as a witness in the crowd, looking at her death, his face worn, haunted, older than his years. It's not subtle. He was painting what he felt, that death was coming, that all the running had led nowhere. What happened to his body? We don't know. He was buried somewhere in Porto Ercole, a pauper's grave, probably. No marker, no ceremony, just another dead man in a town that saw death regularly. For centuries, nobody knew where. Then in 2010, researchers claimed they'd found his bones in a crypt beneath the town. They did DNA testing, compared it to descendants of his family. The results were inconclusive. Maybe they found him, maybe they didn't. It almost doesn't matter. The man was gone. The work remained. Rome learned of his death weeks later. The news travelled slowly, and when it arrived, people didn't quite know what to think. He'd been famous, then infamous, then in exile. His paintings were still in churches. People still talked about them. But the man himself had become a ghost even before he died. Now the ghost was actually dead. The pardon came through, too late. The paperwork had been processing. His patrons had been working on it. Cardinal Gonzaga had intervened. The Pope was going to sign it. Caravaggio would have been allowed to return to Rome, to resume his life, to paint again in the city that had made him famous. But bureaucracy moves slowly, and fever moves fast. By the time the documents were ready, he was already dead on a beach in Porto Ercole. That's the tragedy. Not just that he died young, but that he died right before salvation. If he'd lived another month, if he'd waited in Naples instead of rushing north, if he'd been healthier, if the boat hadn't been seized, if any of a dozen small things had gone differently, he might have lived, might have returned to Rome, might have painted for another 20 years. What would those paintings have looked like? We'll never know. What we do know is what he left behind. Roughly 80 paintings, maybe fewer, maybe more. The attributions are still debated. Some paintings have been lost, some were destroyed, some are probably sitting in private collections or museums, misattributed to other artists. But what survives is extraordinary. The calling of St. Matthew, the martyrdom of St. Matthew, the crucifixion of St. Peter, the conversion of St. Paul, Judith beheading Holofernes, the entombment of Christ, the 7 works of mercy, the beheading of St. John the Baptist, David with the head of Goliath, the denial of St. Peter, each one a revolution, each one showing people what painting could do. The influence was immediate. Artists who'd seen his work in Rome tried to copy his style. The tenebrism, the dramatic lighting, the emotional intensity. They called themselves Caravaggisti, followers of Caravaggio. Some were good. Orazio Gentileschi, his daughter Artemisia, Bartolomeo Manfredi, but most were imitators. They got the surface, the dark backgrounds, the spotlights. They missed what made it work. The psychology. The way Caravaggio's figures felt like real people caught in real moments. The way the light revealed character, not just form. The influence spread across Europe, to Spain, where Velázquez and Ribera studied his techniques, to France, where Georges de la Tour built an entire career on Caravaggesque lighting, to the Netherlands, where Rembrandt absorbed the lessons about darkness and revelation, to Naples, where the style became so dominant it's called the Neapolitan School. Every major artist of the 17th century engaged with what Caravaggio had done, even if they moved beyond it, even if they developed their own styles. They had to reckon with him first, but his reputation collapsed almost as fast as it had risen. By the mid-17th century, taste was changing. The Baroque was giving way to classicism. Caravaggio's naturalism started to look crude. His darkness seemed theatrical. His choice of models, peasants and prostitutes for saints seemed inappropriate. Critics called him vulgar, said he couldn't paint anything beautiful, said he'd corrupted art by bringing it down to the level of the street. Giovanni Pietro Belluri, writing in 1672, acknowledged Caravaggio's importance, but condemned his methods. He praised the technique, the way Caravaggio had mastered light and shadow, but he said the artist had gone too far, that he'd abandoned grace, that he'd painted ugliness instead of beauty, that he'd used his talent to shock rather than to elevate. The criticism stuck. For the next 2 centuries, Caravaggio was remembered as a cautionary tale, a talented artist who'd wasted his gifts, who'd let his personal demons destroy his art. The paintings fell out of favour. They stayed in churches because they'd been commissioned for specific altars. But people stopped looking at them, stopped thinking about them, stopped copying them. The style was out of fashion. The darkness seemed oppressive. The realism seemed excessive. Art moved toward light, toward idealization, toward refinement. Caravaggio's brutal honesty was no longer valued. The 19th century brought some revival. Romantic artists looking for intensity found him. The French realists admired his commitment to painting what he saw. But he was still seen as a problematic figure. Brilliant but flawed, important but dangerous. His life story, the violence and the exile seemed to confirm that genius and madness went together. That great art required suffering. That self-destruction was somehow part of the creative process. Then the 20th century happened, and suddenly Caravaggio looked different. The psychological intensity that had seemed excessive now seemed profound. The darkness that had seemed theatrical now seemed honest. The violence in the paintings now seemed like an acknowledgement of violence in the world. Modern viewers, living through world wars and revolutions and the collapse of old certainties, recognize something in Caravaggio's work: a refusal to look away, a willingness to show people at their worst and their best, a recognition that the sacred and the profane weren't separate categories, but deeply intertwined. Art historians started serious research. They tracked down documents, police records, trial transcripts, letters. They reconstructed his life year by year, sometimes month by month. They identified his models. They traced his movements through Rome, Naples, Malta, Sicily. They analysed the paintings using new technologies: X-rays, infrared imaging, chemical analysis of pigments. They discovered how he worked, the lack of preparatory drawings, the way he painted directly on canvas, the techniques he used to create his effects. And they started asking new questions. Not just was he a great painter, but what was he trying to say? What did the paintings mean? Why did he make the choices he made? Why paint Mary as a dead prostitute? Why show Peter as an old peasant? Why put himself in the paintings as a witness to violence? The answers they found were complex. Caravaggio wasn't just innovating technique. He was challenging assumptions about who deserved to be painted, about what religious art should look like, about the relationship between art and reality. He was saying that saints were human, that divine moments happened to ordinary people, that holiness didn't require beauty, that you could find God in a tavern as easily as in a palace. This was radical theology dressed as painting. The church accepted it because the paintings were so powerful, because they moved people, because they made biblical stories feel immediate and real. But underneath the religious subjects was something more subversive, a leveling impulse, a recognition that the poor and the powerful were equally human, that a prostitute and a virgin both had dignity, that violence and grace existed in the same world, sometimes in the same moment. Looking at his work now, 400 years later, what strikes you first is still the light, the way it cuts through darkness, the way it reveals faces, hands, gestures, the way it creates drama without needing words. But what keeps you looking is something else: the humanity. The way these painted figures feel like they're thinking, feeling, existing in the moment you're seeing them. That's what Caravaggio achieved. Not just a new way of painting, but a new way of seeing. A recognition that art could capture something true about human experience. Not idealized, not perfected, but honest, real, complicated. He painted people as they were, and in doing so, he showed that they were worth painting. His legacy isn't just the paintings hanging in museums and churches. It's in the way we think about art, the expectation that it should feel authentic, that it should engage with reality, that it should make us feel something. Every time someone says they want art that's real or honest or gritty, they're echoing something Caravaggio started. The idea that art's job isn't to make life prettier, it's to make life visible. He painted reality so honestly that centuries later we're still uncomfortable with it. The question is whether he was running from something or towards something, or whether there was any difference. After killing Tomasoni in May 1606, Caravaggio became a fugitive with a death sentence. Anyone who recognized him could legally kill him and collect the bounty. His head had a price. Every painting he made after that moment contains that knowledge. You can see it in the work, the obsession with severed heads, the self-portraits as victims, the way light seems to be searching through darkness for something that's already lost. He fled south first, just outside Rome, then to Naples in September. 4 months of hiding, moving at night, avoiding anyone who might know his face. When he finally reached Naples, he was exhausted, paranoid, and somehow still painting. Naples was different from Rome. Bigger, dirtier, more crowded. The streets were narrow and dark. Disease was everywhere. Poverty was worse than anything he'd seen. But it was also outside papal jurisdiction. The Spanish controlled it, and the Spanish had different priorities than the Pope. Nobody in Naples seemed to care that he'd killed someone in Rome. What they cared about was whether he could paint. And he could. The Neapolitan nobility wanted his work. They wanted the drama, the darkness, the unflinching realism. They wanted Caravaggio paintings, even if they couldn't have Caravaggio the man walking freely through their streets. His first major commission there was the 7 Works of Mercy for the Pio Monte della Misericordia, a confraternity dedicated to helping the sick and poor. They wanted one painting showing all 7 acts of Christian charity: feed the hungry, give drink to the thirsty, shelter the homeless, clothe the naked, visit the sick, visit prisoners, bury the dead. Most painters would have created 7 separate scenes, organised, clear, easy to read. Caravaggio compressed everything into one chaotic moment. Bodies piled on top of each other, actions happening simultaneously. A man being buried, a woman nursing someone through prison bars, a beggar sharing his cloak, angels descending into the crush of humanity. It's claustrophobic, overwhelming. The light barely holds the composition together. Faces emerge from shadow, then disappear back into it. Everyone is pushing, reaching, struggling. It looks like Naples itself. The crowded streets, the desperate poverty, the way the sacred and profane mix together in every alley. He was painting what he saw, not what the church wanted him to see. And somehow they accepted it because it was so powerful, so immediate, so true to the experience of living in that city at that moment. But Naples wasn't enough. He was still a wanted man, still under sentence of death. His only hope was a pardon from the Pope, and to get that, he needed more powerful patrons, more influential connections, more reasons for the church to value him, alive more than dead. Malta was the answer. The Knights of St. John, one of the most prestigious military orders in Christendom. Their Grand Master, Alof de Wignacourt, was a serious art collector, and he wanted Caravaggio. Getting to Malta meant crossing the Mediterranean, dangerous waters, pirates, Spanish galleys, Turkish raiders. For a man with a death sentence, every journey was potentially the last one. But he made it. Summer of 1607. He arrived in Valletta, the fortress capital of Malta. Wignacourt welcomed him, commissioned portraits, put him to work. And here's where things get strange. The Grand Master was so impressed with Caravaggio that he made him a Knight of Malta, inducted him into the order, gave him status, protection, a uniform, the whole ceremony. For a few months, Caravaggio was Brother Caravaggio, a knight, respectable, protected by the order's prestige. He painted some of his greatest works there. The beheading of St. John the Baptist, his largest painting, the only one he ever signed, and he signed it in the blood pooling from John's severed neck. F. Michelangelo, Brother Michelangelo. The painting is massive, 12 feet by 17 feet. It shows the moment after John's execution. The executioner hasn't quite finished the job. John is on the ground, blood spreading. A servant holds a basin to collect the head. Salome waits. Prison guards watch. Everyone frozen in the aftermath of violence. What's striking is the space. Most of the canvas is empty. A bare courtyard, stone walls, darkness. The figures occupy maybe a third of the composition. The rest is just emptiness, silence, the absence where a life used to be. It's painted for a specific space in the oratory of St. John. Still hangs there, and when you see it in person, the scale is overwhelming. You're not looking at an execution. You're present at one. The courtyard seems to extend into the real space around you. The darkness feels physical. This was Caravaggio at the height of his powers, protected, honoured, working on the most important commission of his career. It should have been his salvation. It wasn't. August 1608. 3 months after finishing the beheading, Caravaggio got into a fight with another knight, Fra Giovanni Roero, an organist at the church. The details are unclear as always, but it was serious. Caravaggio broke into Roero's house, wounded him badly, smashed down his door. The whole incident was violent enough that the order couldn't ignore it. They arrested him, threw him in Fort St. Angelo, a prison carved into rock, underground cells, no windows, no light, the kind of place you didn't leave unless someone decided to let you out. He escaped. October 6th. How exactly, nobody knows. Some accounts say he climbed down the fortress walls using ropes, others suggest he was helped. Either way, he got out, stole a boat, sailed to Sicily. The knights were furious. They held a formal ceremony. December 1st, in the oratory where his painting hung. They stood before the beheading of St. John the Baptist, and they expelled him, declared him a rotten and diseased limb, cut him from the order completely. His knighthood was gone, so now he was running again. Sicily first, Syracuse, then Messina, then Palermo, moving from city to city, each time staying just long enough to complete a commission. Never settling, never safe. The paintings from Sicily are darker, more desperate, the burial of St. Lucy, the raising of Lazarus, the adoration of the shepherds. In all of them, the darkness is winning. The light barely reaches the figures. Shadows consume most of the canvas. Bodies emerge from blackness, like they're drowning in it. These aren't the controlled compositions of his Roman period. They're chaotic, rushed. The paint is thinner, applied faster. You can see the brush strokes, the corrections, the places where he changed his mind midway through. He was painting quickly, partly because he was always about to leave, partly because the darkness he was painting was getting harder to escape. Syracuse gave him some breathing room. The city had its own traditions, its own power structures. He could work there, but not for long. Palermo was worse, more dangerous. By then, word had spread. People knew who he was, what he'd done. The knights were looking for him. So were assassins sent by Tomasoni's family. So were Roman authorities who wanted to see the death sentence carried out. He made it back to Naples in October 1609, 14 months after escaping Malta. Why Naples? Probably because he'd found work there before, had connections, patrons who might protect him, but also because he was running out of places to run. Naples, the second time, was different. The city had changed, or he had. He was 40 now, exhausted, paranoid. His health was failing. The years of violence and flight had taken their toll, and Naples knew he was vulnerable. Outside a tavern in October 1609, he was attacked. Several men, armed, they left him for dead. His face was slashed, disfigured. Some accounts say they were trying to destroy his ability to paint. Others suggest they were knights sent from Malta to finish what the order had started. He survived, barely, spent weeks recovering. His face scarred now, permanently marked. When he started painting again, the work was different, slower, the brush strokes looser, less controlled, the light more fragile. He painted David with the head of Goliath, David holding the giant's severed head, looking at it with something between triumph and horror, and the head is Caravaggio's, unmistakably. His face, his features, older now, damaged, dead. It's not subtle. He's painting himself as both victor and victim. The young David who slays the monster, and the monster who deserves to be slain. The whole painting is about guilt, about violence, about the impossibility of escaping what you've done, but he was still trying to escape, still hoping for a pardon. His patrons were negotiating with Rome. The Pope might grant mercy, might lift the death sentence, might let him return. He just needed to get back to Rome, present himself, make the case. July 1610. He packed his things, his paintings, everything he owned, loaded it onto a boat heading north. The plan was to sail to Porto Ercole, a Spanish possession on the Tuscan coast. From there, travel to Rome, hope the pardon came through, hope he could finally stop running. The boat stopped at Palo, a small port south of Porto Ercole. Spanish guards came aboard. They arrested someone. The accounts disagree on who. Some say it was Caravaggio. Others say it was another passenger they mistook for him. Either way, there was confusion, detention. By the time it was sorted out, the boat had left, with all of Caravaggio's possessions still on board. His paintings, his money, everything he needed to survive. He was stranded. No resources, no way to follow the boat, no way to get to Rome. He started walking, north along the coast, trying to reach Porto Ercole, trying to catch up with the boat. It was July, hot. He had no food, no water. The sun was brutal. He walked for days. He made it to Porto Ercole. Collapsed. Fever, exhaustion. Maybe malaria, maybe something else. The records are unclear. What's clear is that on July 18, 1610, Michelangelo Merisi da Caravaggio died, alone, in a hospital for the poor. His possessions lost on a boat somewhere. His pardon possibly already granted but never delivered. 38 years old. The news reached Rome slowly. Some reports said he'd died of fever. Others said murder. Others said he'd simply given up. Nobody knew exactly what happened. Nobody was there. The man who'd revolutionized painting died without anyone watching, without anyone recording his last words or thoughts. His possessions vanished. The boat that carried them disappeared into shipping records. Some of the paintings eventually surfaced, others never did. Generations of art historians have searched, tried to trace what happened, where the works went. Most of the late paintings are lost. What we're left with is what survived, scattered across churches and museums. Each one a fragment of a life lived in darkness, lit by brief moments of impossible brilliance. The paintings themselves tell the story his life couldn't finish, scattered across Europe, hidden in churches, locked in private collections, each one a piece of evidence in a case that's been cold for 4 centuries. But here's what's strange. For decades after his death, nobody could agree on what actually happened. The accounts contradict each other. Some say fever, some say murder, some say he died trying to board a ship, others say he collapsed on a beach. The details shift depending on who's telling the story. What we know for certain is this. July 18th, 1610, Porto Ercole, a small Spanish garrison town on the Tuscan coast. A hospital for the poor. A man dies there, alone, unrecognized. The records list him as a painter, nothing more. His body was buried in the town cemetery. Common grave, no marker, no ceremony. The kind of burial reserved for people with no money and no name. Nobody in Porto Ercole knew they'd just buried one of the greatest painters who ever lived. Rome heard about it weeks later. The news travelled slowly. When it arrived, people weren't even sure it was true. Caravaggio had disappeared before, vanished for months, come back alive. Maybe this was another rumour, another false alarm. But it wasn't. The death sentence that had hung over him for 4 years was suddenly irrelevant. The pardon his patrons had been negotiating might have been granted. We'll never know. It didn't matter anymore. What happened to his work? The paintings he'd carried with him? The pieces that were supposed to secure his return? Gone. The boat that carried them sailed north without him, landed somewhere, unloaded its cargo. Those paintings entered the market anonymously. No provenance, no documentation, just objects to be bought and sold. Some resurfaced quickly, others took decades. A few are still missing. Art historians spend careers trying to track them down, following paper trails through shipping records and customs documents, trying to reconstruct what happened to those final works. Because here's the thing, Caravaggio's late paintings are different. You can see it in the brushwork, looser, less controlled. The figures are still there, the drama, the light cutting through darkness, but something's changed. The confidence is gone, replaced by something rawer, more desperate. The denial of St. Peter. Painted in his final months, Peter sits in shadow. A woman points at him, accusing, "You were with Jesus." And Peter denies it, shakes his head, refuses to acknowledge what he knows is true. The light hits his face, catches the moment of betrayal, the instant where he chooses survival over truth. It's Caravaggio, obviously, the man who'd spent 4 years denying who he was, hiding, running, refusing to acknowledge the murder that defined him. Or the martyrdom of St. Ursula, his last painting, possibly the last thing he ever worked on. Ursula stands there, an arrow through her chest. The Hun king who shot her stands inches away, watching, waiting for her to die. And she looks down at the wound, not at him, at the arrow, studying it, trying to understand what just happened. Her face is calm, almost curious, like she can't quite believe this is real, that this is how it ends. Caravaggio painted that face with incredible tenderness, the same tenderness he'd brought to his early works. The penitent Magdalene, the sacrifice of Isaac. But now it's tinged with something else, recognition, the knowledge that violence doesn't arrive with thunder. It arrives quietly, almost accidentally, and then it's done. After his death, his influence exploded. The style he'd pioneered spread across Europe. Caravaggisti, painters who copied his technique, his drama, his light, they were everywhere. In Rome, Naples, Spain, the Netherlands, France, Artemisia Gentileschi took his approach and made it her own. Rembrandt studied his work, absorbed his understanding of shadow. Velázquez built on his realism, but they didn't know the man. They knew the paintings, the technique, the effect. The person who created them remained a mystery, and as the decades passed, the mystery deepened. By the 18th century, Caravaggio had been almost forgotten. His paintings were still there, hanging in churches, but nobody connected them to a single artist. They were just old works, dark, dramatic, vaguely unsettling. The name Caravaggio meant nothing. It took until the 20th century for him to be rediscovered. Art historians started connecting the pieces, tracking down paintings, building a catalogue, reconstructing his life from police records and court documents, the violence, the genius, the waste. And suddenly he was everywhere again. Museums mounted exhibitions, scholars wrote books, his paintings sold for millions. The forgotten artist became a legend, the life became a story, the kind of story people love. Genius destroyed by his own demons, talent wasted on violence, the tragic artist who couldn't save himself. But that narrative is too simple, too clean. It makes the violence seem inevitable, part of the genius, as if you couldn't have the paintings without the murders, as if the darkness in his work required darkness in his life. That's not how it works. Caravaggio was violent because he was violent, impulsive, angry, incapable of controlling himself. The paintings are brilliant because he was brilliant. Those are separate facts. They existed in the same person, but they didn't cause each other. The tragedy isn't that genius requires suffering. The tragedy is that genius doesn't protect you from yourself. Caravaggio could paint light like nobody before or since. He could capture human emotion with devastating precision. He could see what others missed, and none of that stopped him from destroying his own life. From dying alone on a beach at 38, his grave in Porto Ercole was lost. The cemetery was redeveloped. The bones were moved, mixed with others. For centuries, nobody knew where he was buried. Nobody could visit, pay respects. The man existed only through his work. In 2010, researchers claimed they'd found him. Bones in an ossuary, DNA tests, carbon dating. They announced it with great fanfare. Caravaggio recovered, identified, given back his name. Other researchers disputed it. The evidence wasn't conclusive. The bones could belong to anyone. We still don't know. Maybe we never will. Maybe it doesn't matter, because here's what's true. The bones don't matter. The death doesn't matter. What matters is what survived. 60 paintings, give or take, depending on which attributions you accept. 60 works that changed everything. The calling of St. Matthew hangs in San Luigi dei Francesi, right where Caravaggio put it in 1600. 400 years later, people still line up to see it, stand in that chapel, watch the light hit Matthew's face, feel the shock of recognition. The Supper at Emmaus is in London, the Taking of Christ in Dublin, Judith beheading Holofernes in Rome, the beheading of St. John the Baptist in Malta, Bacchus in Florence, David with the head of Goliath in Rome, Boy with a basket of fruit in Rome, the entombment in Vatican City, the conversion of St. Paul in Rome. Each one is different. Each one is unmistakably his. The light, the darkness, the moment of crisis captured forever, the human face in divine drama. You can trace his influence through every century since. Rembrandt's self-portraits, Goya's disasters of war, Jericho's Raft of the Medusa, modern photography, film noir. Every time someone uses shadow to create drama, they're walking a path Caravaggio carved. But more than technique, he left something else. A way of seeing, a refusal to prettify, an insistence that sacred stories involve real bodies, real faces, real suffering. He brought heaven down to earth, made miracles happen in taverns, put saints in the streets. His Madonnas look like the women you'd pass in any Roman marketplace. His apostles have dirty feet. His angels arrive unannounced in the middle of ordinary moments. He stripped away the ideal and showed what was actually there. People. Just people. Caught in circumstances beyond their control. Trying to understand what's happening to them. That's why the paintings still matter. Not because they're technically perfect. Not because they follow the rules. Because they're true. Emotionally true. Psychologically true. They show us ourselves, in crisis, in doubt, in the moment where everything changes and nothing makes sense. Caravaggio died not knowing any of this would happen, not knowing his work would survive, not knowing he'd be remembered. He died thinking he'd failed, lost everything, ended up exactly where he'd started, poor, alone, forgotten. But failure isn't the end of the story. What you leave behind is the end. And what Caravaggio left behind refuses to stay buried, refuses to be forgotten, refuses to let us look away. The light still cuts through the darkness. The faces still stare out at us. The moment still hangs there, frozen, perfect, unbearable. That's what genius does. It survives the person who created it, outlasts the life, becomes something larger than any individual. Caravaggio's paintings don't belong to him anymore. They belong to everyone who's ever stood in front of them and felt something shift. Everyone who's ever seen themselves in those faces. Everyone who's ever needed to believe that beauty can emerge from darkness. The man died on a beach in 1610. The work lives forever. The paintings hang in churches and museums across Europe, fixed points in geography. But the man who made them never stayed anywhere long enough to be fixed, always running, always one step ahead of the death sentence, until he wasn't. That's what we remember. The violence, the exile, the dramatic death on a beach. It makes a good story. Genius destroyed by his own nature. The tortured artist who couldn't control himself. The narrative is so compelling we forget to ask whether it's true. Here's what's actually true. A stonemason's son lost his entire family to plague when he was 6 years old. Watched them die in agony, buried them, survived. That trauma didn't make him a great painter. It made him damaged. The painting came from somewhere else, from whatever genetic accident produces extraordinary visual intelligence, from years of training, from obsessive observation of how light reveals form. The violence came from the trauma, or from brain chemistry, or from the honor culture of Renaissance Italy, where every insult required a response, or from all of those things combined. But it didn't come from the painting. The two things coexisted in the same person, but they weren't connected. You could remove the violence, and the paintings would still be masterpieces. You could remove the genius, and the violence would still be there. We want them connected because it makes the story satisfying. Suffering produces art, darkness creates beauty. The price of genius is self-destruction. These are comfortable myths because they explain why most people aren't geniuses. They didn't suffer enough, didn't pay the price, didn't walk through the fire. But Caravaggio's life doesn't support that mythology. His best paintings came during his most stable period, when he had Cardinal Del Monte's patronage, when he lived in the palace, when he had security and time and resources. The Contarelli chapel paintings that made him famous were created in peace, not in crisis. The exile paintings are brilliant too, but they're brilliant differently, more desperate, less controlled. The technique is looser because he was painting faster, moving constantly, working in unfamiliar spaces with unfamiliar materials. The darkness increases because he was painting at night by candlelight in temporary studios. The subjects grow darker because his situation was darkening. He was painting what he felt: fear, paranoia, the knowledge that time was running out. That's not romantic, that's just sad. A man who could have painted for another 30 years, could have developed, evolved, explored new directions, cut short because he couldn't stop picking fights, because he killed someone over something so trivial. We're still not sure what the argument was about. Tennis, a woman, a gambling debt. Does it matter? Someone died. Caravaggio ran, and 4 years later, he died alone trying to get home. The paintings are what survived. Not all of them. Some burned in churches, some were destroyed by prudish collectors who found them indecent. Some vanished into private collections and haven't been seen in centuries. But enough survived to change everything. Walk into San Luigi dei Francesi in Rome. Stand in the Contarelli chapel. Look at the calling of St. Matthew. Watch how the light falls, how Christ's hand points, how Matthew's hand mirrors it. Asking me? The moment is 400 years old. The paint is cracking. The canvas is fragile. But the moment is still alive, still happening. You're watching someone's life change. Watching the instant where everything divides into before and after. That's what Caravaggio could do. Capture the instant of transformation. The moment between one reality and another. Not the before, not the after. The exact second where everything shifts. The conversion of St. Paul shows it perfectly. Saul on the ground, knocked flat by light he can't see, the horse looming over him, the groom steadying the animal. Everything is in motion but frozen. The light has already struck. The conversion is happening right now. We're witnessing the birth of Paul, the death of Saul, the moment contained in paint. He did this over and over. The incredulity of St. Thomas, Thomas's finger in Christ's wound. The exact instant where doubt becomes faith. Judith beheading Holofernes, the sword halfway through his neck, the spray of blood. Holofernes' face showing shock, not pain yet, shock. The realization that this is actually happening. The taking of Christ, Judas kissing Jesus, the soldiers moving in, Christ's face calm, already knowing, already accepting, the chaos surrounding a center of absolute stillness. These aren't just technically accomplished paintings. They're philosophical statements about time, about consciousness, about how we experience moments that change us. Caravaggio understood something that most artists miss. The important moments aren't the climax, they're the instant just before, when you can still see both possibilities, when the future hasn't quite closed off the past. That's why the paintings feel so immediate, so urgent. You're not looking at something that happened, you're watching it happen, present tense, right now. And underneath all of it is darkness. The tenebrism everyone talks about. The dramatic shadows, the spotlit figures. It's not just a technique, it's a worldview. Most of reality is hidden. Most of what happens in darkness where we can't see it. The light reveals only fragments, faces, hands, gestures, the rest remains mystery. You can read that theologically, God's light revealing truth in a fallen world, or psychologically, consciousness illuminating small parts of the unconscious, or simply visually. This is what the world actually looks like. Most of it is shadow. We see only what the light allows us to see. Caravaggio painted that truth more honestly than anyone before or since, and he did it while running for his life, while wounded, while sick, while knowing that everything he'd built was collapsing. The darkness in the paintings wasn't metaphorical, it was real, closing in, getting darker, until finally there was no light left. He died in July 1610. The pardon came through in August. If he'd lived one more month, if he'd waited in Naples instead of rushing north, if the Spanish guards hadn't arrested him, if the boat hadn't left without him, if any of a dozen small things had gone differently, but they didn't. History doesn't deal in alternate timelines, only in what actually happened. And what happened is a man died on a beach at 38, having painted 60 works that would influence 4 centuries of art. That's the only fact that matters. The rest is speculation, biography, story. We make narratives out of fragments, fill in gaps with guesses, create meaning from randomness. The truth is simpler and stranger. A damaged person made beautiful things. The damage didn't cause the beauty. The beauty didn't redeem the damage. They just coexisted, like light and shadow, like every human life, like the paintings themselves, perfect and broken, sacred and profane, real, vain.